So I first started being involved with Cambodian refugees in America. I was 15 years old and in South Dakota. And the only Asian family there. So the town's first and only Chinese restaurant. There were towns without Chinese restaurants. So there was this Sino-Khmer family, and they opened up the restaurant. And I, of course, at 15 didn't realize that there were Chinese people and Chinese Cambodian people, you know, or Chinese people from Cambodia. You know, we hadn't been taught anything in school about Cambodia. I knew the Killing Fields movie had come out, and I had seen, you know, a little bit about how this communist regime had taken over the country of Cambodia, and for 4 years just brought hell on earth to the people. If you, just to refresh everyone's memory, from 1975 to December of 1978, the communist regime known as the Khmer Rouge took over the nation of Cambodia and evacuated all the cities, every single city, and forced people into work camps in the countryside. The first people to be targeted was anyone who was educated. Exactly. If you're wearing glasses. So the first thing, anyone who happened to be myopic was killed, straight off. Then they started going by if you knew other languages. And so people that I knew, especially the woman that I got to know who opened the Chinese restaurant in our town, her grandfather was Chinese, so she didn't speak Chinese, but she spoke French because she lived in the capital city of Phnom Penh. And she learned a little French, her husband spoke Chinese, and she knew other languages because, hey, it's like San Francisco, you pick up things, right? She learned really quickly, you don't react when they say a foreign word, because the guards would use that as a tool to see, if you turned your head, oh, you must know what that meant. Or if they said, you know, arrêtez, stop, and you stopped, okay, you're marked for death. That was a way that they would do it to pick you out as being someone who was tainted with foreign influences. So you had to pretend that you understood nothing. And then they started going, because they still couldn't filter out people who had been tainted or they felt might be with the CIA. They were a very paranoid regime. Or also people they felt could be leaders and could lead a revolt. So then they started killing anyone who was overtly Buddhist. Now this is a Buddhist country, so you weren't allowed to pray anymore. If you were a Buddhist monk, they started raiding the temples. And if you were a Buddhist monk and you refused to give up your robes, you were killed immediately. Same thing with Buddhist nuns. So some of the Buddhist monks and nuns went into hiding in the jungles, which was very dangerous. So and people were not allowed to pray anymore. Of course the Catholics, you know, you couldn't say anything. But then the Cham Muslims, some people were Muslim, right? Automatically marked for death. Again, they didn't want any type of ideology that differentiated from their made-up ideology for Cambodia to so-called purify society. So anyway, if you've seen the Killing Fields movie, you know that the reason why Cambodia was known as the Killing Fields is that so many people tried to escape, and the Khmer Rouge put landmines throughout the countryside. And as they tried to escape, they stepped on landmines and they died. It's so much so that all the fields that used to be used for growing, growing food like rice, Cambodia was renowned and since at least the 14th century in China as being Funan or Zhenla, the nation of wealth, because they had 4 growing seasons. Well, not after the Khmer Rouge took over. The fields became filled with bones because they had mined it and people died trying to escape. They also dumped the bodies of the people that they had killed because they felt that they were a threat to the regime. And so if you've seen the movie, you know the harrowing scene where Dith Pram, the photographer, is trying to carry a child through the minefields and doesn't make it. The woman that I first met when I was 15, she was very, very kind to me. And eventually she told me how 3 of her children died in Cambodia. And they died while she was trying to escape by walking through a minefield to the Thai border. And she said, it's so much worse than the movie. It's so much worse. And so I promised her that I would tell her story, because she asked me to. And at the time, when I was 15, you know, it's a little bit difficult. How do you tell someone's story like this, right? And I worked for the town newspaper, and so I thought I would write it up for the town newspaper. And my mother said, don't, you've been receiving threats. Don't draw attention to them. And I said, but I promised I would tell the story. And my mother said, they've been receiving threats, someone's going to burn down their restaurant, they're going to firebomb them. My mother meant take a gasoline, like a beer bottle full of gasoline and stuff, just throw it through the window and set the restaurant on fire. It wasn't a very friendly town, to put it mildly. And so I didn't write it for the town newspaper. Instead, I resigned from the town newspaper because I felt that I couldn't continue writing if I couldn't write the stories that I felt were really important. Then later, when I was in college, I formed a mentoring group for Cambodian and other Southeast Asian refugees who were living in Iowa. Believe it or not, Iowa was a designated refugee relocation state in the 1980s. And so at that point, there were more than 9,000 Cambodians and other Southeast Asians who were relocated to the state of Iowa. And then there actually is a Cambodian temple known as the Angkor Wat of Des Moines in Des Moines, Iowa. And I think it's so cool because if you know French, Des Moines comes from Des Moines, which means some monks, because it was originally the French monks, but now the Cambodian monks have come back. And then later, when I became a reporter for the Associated Press, in all the cities that I lived in, I made sure that I was going to cover the events for the Khmer community and also the Southeast Asian community, because I felt like when you really want to welcome people and say you're part of us, you cover their news. Good or bad, you cover it. And so this has been haunting me for quite some time, since I was a teenager, since I was 15. And I finally have finished the novel that I felt could adequately tell the story with the breadth that it needed. And so I've given you some of the background on the horrors of Cambodia, but this takes place in America. And it talks about what happens after you've survived. How do you keep surviving? How do you overcome the obstacles that you face in America? How do you survive within your own family? And I felt those kind of dilemmas had not been covered. And these are the dilemmas that I found with the people that I had known in my own life in America. And so that's what I wanted to write about. Although there is some background, but you have to know some of the background of the characters to understand them. And the book is told from the viewpoint of one of the younger children. She's old enough to remember a little bit about the Khmer Rouge regime, a little bit about escaping, but not fully old enough to really understand what the adults are talking about when they talk about the past. At the same time, she's young enough to learn English fairly quickly, which is great in school, but not so great when she's communicating with her older relatives because they haven't learned English. And she's forgetting Khmer. So you get that whole dilemma of what happens when you can't communicate within your own family. But it's okay. She's tough. She's a Dragon Chica. So anyway, I'm going to read a small section for you so you get a sense of her voice.